All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Saturday. Welcome to our final session for PPA 535. As you know, today we have 4 articles remaining to cover, and then, as always, I'll do a brief, and I promise it'll be brief summation of the class and just kind of talk about some of the themes I'd like for you to take away from the class with you as we wrap up today. So, since it is Saturday, I do want to give you back as much of your Saturday as I possibly can. We'll go ahead and jump into our first article for the day, and that is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act article. And that one belongs to Angela. So, Angela, the floor is yours.
Sweet. All right. Thank you. Let's see if I can do this. Share. Let's see if I can raise my volume a little bit so you guys can hear me. Okay. Let's see here. You can see it on my full screen right now, right? So let me do, where's presenting here? Start presentation. Okay, there we go. And lower this. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act presented by me. But the official title of this article is Trying Not to Lose Ground, State and Local Government Advocacy During the Passage of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act by J. Wesley Leckrone. I did that without breathing. It's a long title. We're going to be talking about intergovernmental lobbying and policymaking. So Wesley Leckrone uses the example of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 to demonstrate how lobbyists use their ability to navigate politics and try to gain the interest of pivotal members of Congress. How lobbyists, as we've talked about before, is state and local interest groups. Lobbying plays an important role in, during this tax reform, it played an important role to voice the opinions of the state and local interests to the federal government, to Congress, and to the executive branch. Many of the expenditures for tax were spared in the final legislation, which we'll talk about. There were a lot of things that the reform tried to cut. Okay, so the first question that I have, since we're talking about lobbyists, is does anyone know, or can anyone guess the median salary for a lobbyist per year?
I just want to throw out 250 grand.
Wow, not that much, but
150.
You know, Kathy, you're a little bit closer. Yeah, definitely. That's why anyone want a career change? I know we're in this for any of our pursuits, but I was wondering about a career change. So actually, average lobbyist makes about $116,000 per year. That's not bad. Range typically falls between $94,000 and $161,000. But I'm sure it probably could be a lot more than that depending on your abilities. Okay, so the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was the first comprehensive tax reform since the Tax Reform Act of 1986. So quite a long time ago. It did 4 major things. So the first one, obviously, is it cut taxes by approximately $1.46 trillion to the federal government over a 10-year period. It kept 7 tax brackets for individuals, cut taxes for most of those brackets. The top rate decreased from 39.6% to 37%, and it actually increased the percentage of people paying taxes from 44% to 47.5%. The second thing it did was the standard deduction. So the standard deduction for individuals rose quite a bit, and couples. Individuals, it went and almost doubled to $12,000 for individuals and $24,000 for couples. And it streamlined the tax process, so they anticipated that most people would choose the standard deduction over itemization. And then also SALT was capped at $10,000. You could no longer deduct more than that from your taxes. The third thing it did was less business tax. So the corporate rate was reduced 35% to 21%. And this was hopefully to incentivize new investments and to have job creation in the US. Taxes were cut by approximately $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Okay, so the fourth thing it did was there's no tax penalty. So when we had Obama bring in the Affordable Care Act, what the new tax did was, the new law did was there's no tax penalty for non-compliance. So the tax penalty for it went to $0. Okay, so our second question is, what does SALT stand for? Can anyone, if you read it, or does anyone just want to take a guess? Okay, it's actually pretty simple. It's a simple acronym. It's state and local taxes. Did I cut somebody off? I can't see anyone's face right now. I'm sorry. And then the second question that I have here is, does anyone remember how that affected you on your taxes? Like did you decide to take the standard deduction over itemization? I usually itemize, but it changed after this year.
Mine went up 1%. That's how it affected me.
Okay.
It was very small. My tax guy pointed it out, and there were a lot of deductions for a construction worker that all of a sudden disappeared. All of them. My union dues, all of my safety equipment, any of the tools that I bought, they all went away.
Likewise, yeah, especially for my job, same thing. I was quite surprised. And then I also got married. So I was expecting it to be a lot better, and it was not. It was a lot worse for me. Okay, so let's see here. What's the next one? Okay, so these are the effects, the tax reform effects. So this is what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, how it affected state and local governments and taxpayers. So, well, actually for the federal government, it cut $1.46 trillion in revenue over a 10-year span. It's one of the government's largest expenditures. And for the states, it affected them because they have a rolling, static, or selective conformity to the taxation code. So rolling means that when the tax code changes, the state will automatically adopt those changes. Static, California is a static state. They'll automatically assume the tax code, but it's at a certain date. So rather than doing it when it's enacted, California will do it. I believe it's January 1st is when the code will take in effect. And then selective conformity is where a state will only take certain portions of the tax code. They'll only adopt certain aspects of the legislature. Also with the rolling and static is that it's the whole, they take on the whole tax code, but what was I going to say about that? Yeah, so it's the whole thing. Okay. Now, the third thing is the state and local tax deduction on taxpayers. The governments would not be affected by it as much as taxpayers, because we, like Paul was saying, we're not able to completely write off our income, our sales tax, or property tax, any of our like the things that we buy for our work or whatnot. We're not able to deduct those things now. It's capped at $10,000. And it's especially true for states where there's high taxes, that it would affect them more. Okay, so this is my next question. This is kind of a fun one. I was like, $1 trillion, it sounds like a really big number. So how would you represent that? Can anyone tell me how many zeros there might be in $1 trillion? A is 9, B is 12, and C is 15. You could put it in the text box as well, the chat box if you guys want.
I'll go with C.
C. Yeah, that was my first guess too. So it's actually
It's 9.
9. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so it's actually B. It's B. So it's 12. So this is the best way for me to kind of visualize how much that would be. So if you took 1 trillion $1 bills, it would almost reach from the earth to the sun. And fun fact is the federal government currently, as of today or when I last Googled it, $28.43 trillion in debt. That's a lot of trips to the sun.
Yep.
I was like,
I want to add more to that.
okay, so intergovernmental lobbying, there's 2 types that the author discusses. There's policy generalists. So they kind of talk about the overall issues that are going to affect the state and local governments. These are your elected officials and office holders. And then there's policy specialists. These are the bureaucratic professionals. They have a specific goal or agenda, how they want to spend the money for, well, here it says particular cause or desired purpose. So they're more focused on what it is that they're trying to achieve. And their overall role is to advocate for governments to the congressional and executive branches. And the author talks about 4 mechanisms that lobbyists can use to be successful. He says there is no certainty in this, but the 4 ways that they try to persuade congressional members to vote for what it is that they're hoping for. One of them, the very first one, is to present a united front. Now, what they're saying, or what he was saying, is to have a bipartisan view, to kind of what is positive, what's going to be positive for everyone involved, what's going to be positive, how is it going to benefit them, how can it possibly personally benefit a Congress member. So you want to try to make sure that you think about the policy as a whole and how all members that are involved are going to be affected. The second is policy expertise. Basically what this is, just like I said before, how is it going to benefit a congressperson? How is it going to benefit a local government? How is it going to benefit each of these intergovernmental lobbying groups in a positive way? Let's see here. And then the third one is to secure a congressional pivotal voter. So they are more successful. A lobbyist is more successful if they can find somebody in Congress who is a influential person who's able to stand behind it and influence others to sway their vote towards it as well. And then the 4th technique he talks about is having a high profile public campaign. Media involvement, if you can bring it to the national level, if you have more people that are influenced by it, then it kind of can persuade the federal government to act in certain ways. And then we talked about this Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995 a couple of weeks ago. And the fun fact was that it was resulted from this type of pressure. Okay, so arguments and debates. So the lobbyists had different views on the things that were going to be affected by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts. The first 2 major ones were the state and local taxes, and then tax exempt bonds. Now, lobbyists who were opposed to the SALT changes basically tried to frame it that it was going to hurt the middle class. Number one, it was going to hurt the middle class by double taxation, saying that if they were not able to deduct all of their spending or, for basically it would, any money that they paid to the state and to the local governments would be taxed twice. And then the other way that it was going to affect the middle classes was taking away this benefit for us. And this benefit actually helped our economy. Also, they tried to frame it in a way that it was going to affect the state and local government by its elimination, since the state had become institutionalized in their tax systems, it would hurt their ability to provide services to us. The second way is that SALT helped to fund important programs, state and local programs like infrastructure, public safety, and schools. And if it was cut, then they wouldn't be able to finance these programs or not finance them as well. And then for the tax exempt bonds, the lobbyist reframed it in these ways where, first of all, a tax exempt bond allows businesses or individuals to accrue interest on these bonds. It's not federally taxed. So they were going to cut these bonds. The lobbyist tried to say that these bonds were used for infrastructure spending. So from 2003 to 2012, state and local governments issued from these bonds issued $1.65 trillion in bonds. 500 million was used towards school construction, 300 million was towards hospitals, and then 250 million, give or take a couple million with all of these numbers, was towards water and sewer facilities. And then repealing it would make the bonds less appealing to investors. And they were saying that there would be a potential loss of $500 billion in interest for state and local governments. Three key programs were going to be cut, or they thought they were going to be cut. So the three were education, community development, and transportation. So with education, lobbyists or groups were concerned that the deficits in the tax reform would lead to cuts in federal spending. They said that $4 billion in Medicaid went towards schools for students that had disabilities and other medical services. The one thing here is that the tax reform actually expanded the 529 program, which I didn't know anything about, but apparently it's a program, it's a savings plan for individuals to save for college. But what the tax reform did is it expanded it so that people could use that savings for children from kindergarten through 12th grade. So now I guess it's from kindergarten and through college, so that helped. They were successful, the lobbyists were successful in preserving the $250, which is not a lot of money, it seems, tax credit for purchasing school supplies. I can't imagine it's only $250 for teachers to purchase school supplies, but at least we got to save that. Community developments, we have private activity bonds and tax exempt municipal bonds were a priority for the groups to focus on. With the PABs, it's hard for me to say that one. Private activity bonds, they were preserved overall. It was the low income housing tax, which supports 96,000 jobs. This is how they framed it. 96,000 jobs and contributed to $9 billion to the economy. We had the historic tax credit, which was framed as a job creation credit. And then the new market tax credit, which was, it's to promote businesses in low income areas. They were all preserved. And then transportation, with the cuts to transportation by the tax reform, the lobbyists were trying to say that they wouldn't be able to pay for transportation or highways, things like that. There were lessened revenues from gasoline and from diesel fuels to the Highway Trust Fund. Overall, there were 47 interest groups involved, including the Big Seven. Now, for my next question is, can anyone tell me or who the Big Seven are? So we've got A, which is the 7 most influential politicians. B was the 7 largest US businesses. C is 7 nonprofit organizations. D is 7 American financial institutions. And then if anyone can name them, which I do not expect at 9:30 in the morning, but can anyone name these businesses or institutions or politicians? My money is on Paul. For some reason, I always think Paul has the answers.
I think it's C.
C? Okay. All right, Teresa. Anyone else have a guess? Okay.
I'm sort of I'm toggled between B and D.
B and D. Yeah. Can anyone name them? Paul, I was thinking you might be able to name them, but that's really hard. So, okay, so it's actually C. So, Teresa, you were correct. The Big Seven are a group of nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations made up of state and local officials. So the seven are Council of State Governments, International City and County Management Association, the National Association of Counties, National Conference of State Legislatures, National Governor Association, National League of Cities, and the United States Congress of Mayors. So what they did, they actually wrote a letter to Congress talking about all these changes and not wanting a lot of these things to happen. But these are the outcomes that did happen. So two major ones, SALT was capped and tax exempt bonds were kept, including the PABs that we talked about, due to the lobbyists' influence. So we're going to talk about tax exempt bonds first. Why is it that they were kept and SALT was not? So let me get to my notes there because I'm trying to remember. Okay, so the author talks about the reasons why they're so different in their outcomes was based on not having a unified front. Like we talked about before, if you have a unified front, you can have more positive of a result because you can prove how it positively affects more people. So with the tax exempt bonds, lobbyists were able to prove that it benefited all state and local governments. Since they don't carry any debt, there were no winners and losers in this argument. Basically, it represented a universal interest. And then also they were able to prove with a tangible outcome how tax exempt bonds were beneficial by discussing infrastructure. They were able to basically have more backing to why it should be kept. Now, SALT was actually capped. One reason that he talks about why is because it was became partisan. The actual argument for it became Republicans versus the Democrats. They weren't able to make it a universal benefit for all. Republicans saw it as the Democrats had more benefit by keeping it, whereas the Republicans, they saw it as a huge drain on the federal government since it is the largest expenditure. Even though the lobbyists tried to make it so the Government Financial Officers Association created a report that showed it across the county and the nation as an economic benefit. But the Republicans have been wanting to cut this for several decades, and they just were not persuaded because you have to remember at that time it was a Republican Congress with Trump. Let's see here. So some of the things that the SALT was disproportionately benefited high wealth, high tax Democratic states. And Republicans needed to find revenue to fund for individual and business tax cuts. So gutting it was a great way of doing that. Also, Congress made it effective immediately in 2018, which hurt many states. But some states tried to do a workaround where I'm not sure how legal it was that they're doing this. I think something that I read said that they're still trying to see if this is something that is legal, but states including Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Oregon, their workarounds were creating charitable trusts, which allow people who made more than $10,000 of state and local taxes to donate the remainder of it to these trusts. And so basically their tax return would equate to what it was before SALT. And then there was a possible lawsuit. Some states were going to actually try to do a lawsuit or have lawsuits to say that this was against the Constitution. So does anyone know or have any information on whether any of the states did a lawsuit and what the outcome might have been?
I have a question for you, Angela.
Yeah.
So they made these charitable contributions, like this exemption. So does that mean that it then cost the state and local governments a tax expenditure?
That's a great question. I do not know. Maybe maybe Dr. Powell knows, but I didn't even think that far ahead with that one.
I totally didn't mean to put you on the spot with that. I'm sorry.
Oh, not at all. I don't care. No, now I'm going to Google it though, because I'm really curious. But okay, so there actually was a lawsuit, and it was by Connecticut, Maryland, New Jersey, and New York. And it was struck down though because the judge, I guess Judge J. Paul Oetken, dismissed it because he said that the states could not prove that it was unconstitutional. And I guess they were trying to say, in my notes here, just, something that it was basically against the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, taxing power, and the 10th and 16th Amendment. So I tried to Google those amendments and read through them to see, but it was shot down. All right, and that is it. Does anyone have any questions? Paul, I'm going to Google that right now. So if I get the answer before the end of the class, I'll let you know.
Great job, Angela.
That was
Well
actually,
done.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, good job, Angela. It's a tough article to do, and especially at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. But you did a very nice job with it. You covered all the major aspects of it. And the one thing that really, there are several things that jump out at me from the article. The one that really jumps out at me is what you discussed, Angela, and the SALT deduction, and limiting that SALT deduction to $10,000. And it's interesting to see, the states that were hurt primarily by that. Whereas you said states like Connecticut and New York and New Jersey, Oregon, these states are considered to be high tax states, and that's why that residents in those states were hurt by that, because they do pay a lot in state and local taxes, more so than perhaps in a Mississippi or in Alabama. But the thread that ties those states together, obviously, is they're very blue states. And I don't think that fact was lost on the authors of the act. I think they knew that very well when they were writing the act. And the workaround issue is really the one that has these big implications for American federalism, because here we have the federal government coming in and saying, we're going to limit the SALT deduction to $10,000. And then you have these states, as Angela talked about, doing these workarounds, or we'll create these charitable trusts, and then the deductions that you normally would get that you cannot get above that $10,000, will then apply those as charitable deductions. And so you can still get the same amount of deductions. It's just they're going to be in a different category than they were before. Instead of being a SALT deduction, they're going to be a charitable deduction. And so it was just kind of like, moving the shells around a little bit, and it's the same effect, it's just different categories. The IRS very quickly said no to those workarounds. They said, we're not going to allow those workarounds. We're not going to permit it. And so you had this conflict between a federal agency, the IRS, and the state governments. And it's a real clear federalism type of conflict. And again, when you try and challenge it as being unconstitutional, like states did, that's a difficult thing to prove because of the 16th Amendment. 16th Amendment of the Constitution says that Congress may levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportionment. That's a very broad grant of taxing power to Congress. Any source whatsoever without apportionment basically says Congress can tax anything that Congress feels is appropriate to tax. And that includes, these changes to the federal income tax system, taking away these SALT deductions. And so, that kind of set up this federalism battle, if you will, between these high tax blue states and the federal government under the Trump administration and the IRS. And it was a really interesting battle that, we'll see what happens. We've been talking in Congress, not me, but Congress has been talking about undoing that limitation on the SALT deduction and allowing the SALT deduction again to go above $10,000. They haven't taken action on that yet, but there is a lot of conversation in Congress about trying to undo that SALT deduction from the act. So I'll stop it there because, again, I know we have limited time this morning. But thank you, Angela. Very well done. Again, a lot of details in that article, and I think you handled the details very well. So thank you. Okay, we'll go on to our next article, which is the voting reform article, and that one belongs to Emily.
Okay, okay, let me pull it up real quick. Okay. Okay, can you see that?
We can.
Okay. Alrighty, so I will be doing my presentation today on the article, an alternative route to voting reform and the right to vote, voter registration, redistricting, and U.S. state constitutions, and that's by Nancy Miller, Keith Ham, Maria Aroka, and Ronald Hedlund. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. So we'll be talking about, the states, how the states use their state constitution to decide their criteria of the right to vote, voter registration process, and redistricting, and enact amendments and provisions to do so. The federal government leaves it up for the states to be responsible for their elections, and each state will have different requirements / processes, or could have different requirements / processes. So the US Constitution reserves to the states the responsibility for regulating most aspects of elections. Recently, the Supreme Court has weakened the tools for federal officials to challenge state election practices under the Voting Rights Act, and signaled a great deal of deference to state authority over election laws. So the author does focus on three main points to support this argument. Number one being recent efforts by voting and election reformers to utilize state constitutions in their efforts to challenge restrictive voting laws, as well as partisan gerrymandering. And number two, diverse and often underappreciated landscape of voting and election laws in states and the resources available to reformers at the state level. And then third point that the author focuses on is utilizing state constitutions to ensure that citizens' rights are protected. The next slide, we'll go ahead and talk about just the federal and the state's government's role in elections. So the Constitution does provide a little guidance when considering the administration of federal elections. The founders appear to have delegated responsibility for the administration of elections to state governments, although they did reserve for Congress the power to regulate federal elections as needed. However, when we look at it as a whole, the Congress has used this regulatory power sparingly and has largely permitted elections mainly to be administered by state and local government. So in the Constitution, it appears that the responsibility of administration of elections have been placed on state government. Since the Constitution has been written, the Congress has passed a few laws to protect citizen access to the ballot box, or making it easier to vote, with several civil rights acts and voting rights acts, to name just a few. The author does focus on one of the most significant, which is the Voting Reform Act. So I'll just talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act. Oh, I think I said voting reform in the previous one. I meant Voting Rights Act. So this one we'll be talking about just a little bit about the Voting Rights Act. So Congress did pass the Voting Rights Act, VRA for short, in 1965 to protect against race discrimination in voting and end disenfranchisement of African American voters in southern states and all other states with a history of discriminatory voting and election law. So the VRA was later amended to protect against discrimination against language minorities as well. This momentous piece of legislation delivers on the promise of the 14th and the 15th Amendment that every citizen is entitled to an equal opportunity to participate in our democracy. So the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the US, including former enslaved people, and granted all citizens equal protection of the laws. And the 15th Amendment just gave the right of citizens of the United States to saying the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the US or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the 14th and the 15th Amendment was supposed to protect the voter rights from discriminatory practices. However, there were southern states that later passed laws and constitutional provisions that place limits on voting. So the question I have is, what laws or series of provisions did southern states pass, or what were the laws or series of provisions that southern states passed that contradicted the Voting Rights Act that the Congress passed? So I guess what were the laws or series of provisions? What were they called, I guess?
Would that be Jim Crow?
Yes, that is correct. So it is the Jim Crow laws. So we'll just talk just a little bit about the Jim Crow's laws. Southern states in the late 18th and early 19th centuries passed a series of laws and constitutional provisions commonly referred to as Jim Crow laws that segregated white and African American citizens in the region and disfranchised. So examples of provisions used to restrict African American suffrage included the grandfather clause, poll taxes, literacy/understanding tests, and restrictions on felon voting. So in the Redemption era, constitutions of the South broadly restricted the right to vote to any persons being found guilty of criminal acts and are the origins of many felony disenfranchisement laws today. So an example that the article does mention or talk about is how the Alabama Constitution of 1901 denies the voting to any person found guilty of a crime involving moral turpitude. In the Jim Crow South, this meant that many African American voters were disenfranchised for infractions such as loitering or public intoxication, to name a few. So next slide. So the voting, it's supposed to be Voting Rights Act being challenged. So the VRA was challenged in federal court several times immediately after its passage of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren upheld its constitutionality. So voting rights advocates successfully used the Voting Rights Act to challenge state suffrage and election laws when they appeared to disproportionately impact minority voters. Voting and election reformers utilize state constitution to challenge restrictive voting laws, and the federal government is not able to use the VRA to challenge state election practices. It's supposed to be voting rights. Sorry about the misspell. I keep calling it voting reform for some reason. Okay, so section 5 of the VRA requires states and localities with a history of discrimination to obtain approval from the Department of Justice or a court before changing voting rules, process known as pre-clearance. So in 2013, the Supreme Court held in Shelby Court versus Holder that the formula for determining which jurisdiction were subject to pre-clearance was unconstitutional because it was outdated. So this decision ushered in a wave of efforts in states previously covered under Section 5 to restrict voting rights, leaving to Congress the responsibility of drafting an updated coverage formula to restore the force of Section 5. So the court invalidated the coverage formula in Section 4B of VRA, which determines which jurisdictions have to seek federal preclearance for changes in voting or election laws. So while only part of the country was covered by the requirement, the process brought transparency to how maps were being redrawn in several large states in the South, like Georgia and Texas, as well as parts of New York and California. So it is clear that the states have the most influence over who votes and how. The details regarding the regulation of voting and administration of elections are largely determined by state and local governments. The authority to regulate is decentralized to the extent that the rules and the processes governing elections for the same federal office vary substantially from state to state. So for example, in Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, a candidate must win a majority of the vote to be declared the winner, whereas in other states, only a plurality is required. So the next slide, just a quick question. Do you think giving states the right to decide who votes and how they vote can sometimes contradict the VRA and jeopardize democracy?
Yes.
Yes, I think so as well.
I live in Texas for just another 6 weeks, so I can declare absolutely.
Yes, so I know, I think as well agree with you. I don't know if anyone has anything else to say. I'll just add just a little bit. So I know, the American system of government is known as, federalism, which is a system of government in which the same territory is controlled by 2 levels of government. So both the national government and the smaller political subdivisions have the power to make laws, and both have certain level of autonomy from each other. However, I think, giving the states the right to decide who votes and how they vote could lead to voter disenfranchisement and kind of contradicts the VRA just a little bit. It also threatens democracy, I think. So when these laws that are passed by the states affect voting rights, I'm not really sure how that's supposed to be protecting citizens' rights to vote. So this is my thought on it. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, Emily's Teresa. I agree with you. It seemed to be again, as you just said, under federalism, individual rights. Well, meant to say federal as well as state, but I mean, at what point though, to where I feel states can have their authority to decide who votes and whatnot, but I mean, to the point where it it creates like you said, I can't say that word, but to where it's not equal for all the residents, and to what point does the federal government need to really make sure to change that, at least for the nation, to make sure it's standardized for everybody, and make sure that some of these states that are have this agenda of making sure some of the residents are not able to, or basically have some limitations to some of the residents. I mean, there needs to be a balance, I guess, is what I'm saying. But I guess that's where the Supreme Court, right, or the judicial system is supposed to help with that. But I don't know. It's really hard to have that right balance, and I guess Congress just need to do their job and trying to fix that somehow.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree with that. Anyone else have anything to add? No? Okay, so we'll just move on to the next slide. Excuse me. So can you guys think of any events in the past 10 years or so where our voter access was restricted or threatened? So I have a few, I guess a few examples. So so after the 2010 elections, for the first time since the peak of the Jim Crow era, states across the country began to enact laws making it more difficult to vote. So this wave of voter suppression was intertwined with race and the nation's changing racial demographics, and was, at least in part, a backlash against rising turnout among communities of color, contributing to the election of the nation's first Black president. Efforts to suppress the votes of communities of color accelerated in 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted a key part of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County versus Holder case. And also another instance, so after the pandemic upended election administration in 2020, a year that witnessed record turnout, Republican-led states like Arizona passing new restrictive voting laws, while Democratic states such as Illinois have increased voters' ballot access. What we are kind of seeing across the country, I guess, is a widening divide. So some states are working on strengthening and expanding participation in our democracy, just as significant numbers of states are working to restrict it. So following former president fraud claims and efforts to overturn the 2020 election, GOP-led states that have restricted ballot access or made changes to election administrations, like Arizona, Florida, and Texas. That's just a few examples I could think of. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that. No, okay. Could move on to the next slide. Okay, so next slide, we'll talk about redistricting. So during a significant period of American history, legislators were given almost complete responsibility for state legislative and congressional redistricting. So throughout the years, the US Supreme Court has taken a backseat on issues surrounding partisan gerrymandering. So partisan gerrymandering is defined as, drawing electoral district maps / lines to favor one political party over the other. So in 2017 to 2018, there were two cases, Gill versus Whitford concerning a Wisconsin legislative district map, and Benesick versus Lamone concerning a Maryland congressional map. So during arguments in these two cases in March of 2019, at the time, the two newest judges of the court, Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, engaged in a line of questioning, indicating support for the position that states are the best venue for remedying partisan gerrymandering claims. So the March 2019 oral arguments and questioning in the latest US Supreme Court, partisan gerrymandering cases noted that several states are attempting to address partisan gerrymandering on their own. So as mentioned in the article, in a Pennsylvania case where a Republican favored map was overturned, state Supreme Court justices are elected in partisan elections, and Democratic justices hold a 5-2 majority. The Commonwealth Court judge who initially ruled the map constitutional is a Republican. So it is quite likely that plaintiffs wishing to overturn gerrymandered maps in other states may be more successful where justices are chosen in partisan elections and the current composition of the court aligns with the partisan of the plaintiff. So just, yes, in conclusion, the US Supreme Court has under-enforced the right to vote, thus not doing the best to protect voting rights. Almost every state constitution includes direct, explicit language granting the right to vote, as contrasted with the US Constitution, which means voting rights are only implicitly. The U.S. Constitution directs the inquiry over voter eligibility to state sources. So Justice Scalia was quoted saying the elections clause of the U.S. Constitution empowers Congress to regulate how federal elections are held, but not who may vote in them. Voter eligibility is strictly left to the states. So with the conservative majority of the Roberts, well, at the time the Roberts Court, what they call it, signaling greater deference to states in voting rights and partisan gerrymandering cases, the unharnessed potential of state constitutions and state judicial systems may become the new preference venue for challenging laws that potentially infringe upon a citizen's right to vote. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Good job, Emily.
Thank you.
Well done, Emily.
Thank you.
Yeah, very, very well done, Emily. And I think, when we read this article, some of it can be terrifying for us, because when you think about how the Supreme Court has stepped away from the Voting Rights Act and the federal supervisors and the pre-clearance requirements for new voting maps in states, it really has, kind of been a retrenchment back to state governments having almost complete control over elections. And I think that one of the things that we are seeing, obviously, as Emily discussed, is you've got states that are really actively pursuing changes to their voter registration laws to make it more difficult for certain populations to vote, and trying to house the power over certifying electors within state legislatures. And now, the way in which the Constitution is written, the way in which the Electoral College works, is that when you have your presidential election, then you have your state of electors your slate of electors that are chosen by the voters, and then the governor then certifies those electors. Well, in a lot of states, a lot of Republican-controlled states now, we see legislation that will say the state legislature has the ability to take those electors who have been voted in by the voters, throw out that slate of electors and replace it with their own slate of electors. And so you could have a state legislature that could overturn, it's a cliche phrase, but overturn the will of the people by throwing out the electors that were elected by the people. I think this is going to really be the battleground that we're going to see fought over the next couple of years. The other complicating factor is in terms of drawing these maps, because the Trump administration delayed the census. So a lot of these state and local organizations that need to draw their maps, they had to wait in order to get the census data, the enumeration data. And so they're already well behind where they normally would be. I know that when I served on a school board, usually you would do your new maps based upon the census results. You usually bring in your demographer and you'd be working on that in April or May. Now districts are just now getting started on it in October and November, so there's several months behind. The problem with that is it then contracts the amount of public input that you can get on these new maps that you are drawing. And then it also contracts the period of time where you can have lawsuits over political gerrymandering that could be going on. And so I think there is a heightened possibility of even more partisan gerrymandering, cracking and packing of districts because of this shortened time frame, because of the delay of the census results going out to state and local governments. And so I think when you're looking at federalism, I think it's really these elections that are really going to be the shifting sands of federalism over the next couple of years, and something we really need to keep a very, very close eye on. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I'll stop there. And for the sake of time, we'll move on to our next article, which is the Governors in Control article, and that's Dalila. So, Governors in Control.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so I got the Governors in Control article, the executive orders, state local preemption, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a fairly recent article that was published July of this year. This article talked about the impact the executive orders had on local governments. The executive orders governors issued in responding to the pandemic impacted local governments in many ways. Some governors had to rely on cities and counties to meet their citizens' needs by implementing stricter means than those issued by the state, and others didn't allow action that went against their executive orders. They received little direction from the federal government on how to handle the pandemic, so they had to turn to executive orders. And this quote was mentioned in the article, and I thought it described well the positions the states were in. So as Washington has stumbled, governors of both parties have acted to fill the void. This spring, the balance of power has been flipped, with states forced to compensate for the failings of the national level. So the states were really at the forefront of handling the pandemic. The response to COVID-19 has provided a new venue for state centralization and preemption research because the executive orders were unique in 4 ways. First, they were issued in an emergency situation where the residents of the state turned to the governor for solutions and reassurance. There were time constraints. Actions happened in a short period of time, which limited court action. There were bipartisan preemption directives. Both Republican and Democratic governors acted to close the states or prevent local action at the start of the pandemic. And there were no corporate ties. The executive orders were not closely connected to corporate or other interests, which is common with other preemptive measures. The research on federalism has focused on centralization by the federal government and not as much on the states. And the research there tends to focus on the statutes and not executive orders. Although state preemption isn't common, it's becoming more common and aggressive, with states penalizing localities that don't comply. The National League of Cities had a report on preemption in the pandemic, and they outlined various forms of preemption that have occurred that I thought would be useful to mention. So the first is vacuum preemption, which is when a state doesn't allow cities to enact a policy without the state setting any policy of its own. And this happened in Iowa, where the governor had not issued a mask mandate and didn't allow local governments to implement a mask mandate. Ceiling preemption, this is when a state prohibits cities from doing anything above what the state law already mandates. In Texas, after the request of cities for a mask mandate, the governor issued a mask mandate for people in public spaces for certain counties, and localities couldn't enact a mask measure that was stricter than the state standard. Floor preemption is when a state sets a minimum standard and allows cities to enact laws with requirements that are more strict than the minimum standard, like in North Carolina. North Carolina set this early in the pandemic with its emergency order allowing for greater local restrictions. And then punitive preemption, this is when a higher level of government threatens to punish a lower level of government. Nebraska used this when it threatened to withhold CARES Act funding if a county implemented a mask mandate. Okay, so there were a record number of executive orders issued in some states. New Jersey issued the most COVID-related provisions in their executive orders at 106, while Missouri only issued 1. Can you think of an example of an executive order that was issued during the pandemic that directly impacted you or your agency? Or just an executive order that you're familiar with that took place during the pandemic?
Yeah, for me, more recently is the mandated vaccine for all DoD or Department of Defense federal employees. So that's affecting me right now. And I mean, the labor union for the installation, kind of, you know, at first try to do something, but I think the fact that essentially, to summarize it, is there's really, you know, not a whole lot they can do, because they're saying that the president can actually give that emergency order for the safety of the nation, and obviously for federal employees being kind of directly under that under the president through his executive powers. So we're actually we're affected by that, and we need to comply actually by 22nd of November. So that's directly impacting me and my agency. Over.
It's a good example. Anyone else?
When this first started, the mask mandate and trying to control even contractors, you know, as a local agency, trying to enforce that with third-party contractors was pretty difficult.
Yeah, I agree. We had a hard time with that as well. Does anyone have any other examples they'd like to share? Okay, so yeah, there were definitely a lot of executive orders issued. And let's see, I found this online and I thought it would be interesting to share. So Newsom issued more executive orders in 2020 alone than Jerry Brown did in 2 terms. The yellow on the graph is Newsom right here. And he issued a total of 59 executive orders, and 53 of them were COVID related. In their research, they examined state preemption of localities using a data set of actions the governors took that affected local governments, and they conducted a 55 state cross-sectional analysis of the governor's executive orders to help with COVID-19 and the reopening of their state's economy. They coded the content and the timing of the politics related to local governments, focusing on whether the actions empower or preempt local governments, and how these actions changed over the course of the pandemic. So they focused their research on the first 5 months of the pandemic and used data from executive orders issued from March 19th, 2020 to August 1st. And the research question they were trying to answer was if governors acting in unprecedented emergency situations centralize the authority of the state. So the authors were looking to see if governors issuing executive orders in response to the pandemic took away the power from local governors or governments. Okay, so they broke down the first 5 months of the pandemic into 3 phases of intergovernmental response. The first phase began when Washington Governor Jay Inslee issued the first state of emergency on February 20th. Also in this phase, Trump signed the national state of emergency on March 13th. Then shortly after, on March 19th, Newsom issued the first stay-at-home order. And in March, Congress also provided funding for COVID-related expenses and passed the CARES Act. But the system that was set up by the White House had states competing for resources. The second phase began on April 20th, and this was when South Carolina began reopening, and some states followed with a phased reopening plan. And then the third phase began on June 22nd, when a COVID-19 surge occurred and states halted their reopening stages and began implementing mask mandates. The 3 phases had a variety of executive orders, which included different response actions taken by governors. And then this map shows how preemptive or empowering the executive orders were toward local governments. States with a darker shade of blue were more empowering, and those with the lighter shades were more preempting. Over half of the local executive order provisions were preemptive. Only little over 1/4 were enabling. When we look across the phases, there was more preemption in phase 1 during the closing than in the other 2 phases, and phase 3 had the most enabling or empowering executive orders. In their research, they found that COVID-19 related executive orders typically preempted local authority and centralized the authority of the state rather than empowered local governments to handle local problems. They also found that states that generally allowed local governments to exercise more autonomy, governors were more likely to issue centralizing orders throughout the pandemic. And they found that the party of the governor wasn't consistently significant in the tendency towards centralization, and neither was the ideological mismatch with local officials. But they did find some variations across the time periods. In phase 3, Democratic governors were more likely to associate with preemption, but ideological asymmetry led to more empowerment. And then because the study was only based on the first 5 months of the pandemic, and we're almost like 2 years in, it makes me wonder if the findings would vary if additional data was included. They also mentioned how the pandemic gave governors a tremendous amount of power. State legislatures had a little involvement in policies. And then I found this chart online that shows the bills sent over to the governor in 2020 here in California. And there were 428 bills sent over, and of those, Newsom vetoed 56 of them. So as you can see, there's a significantly lower amount of bills than previous years. 2020 was the least quantitatively productive year in the Capitol since 1967. So it was a low point for bill passing, but a record high for executive orders. And then finally, do you think we can expect the use of executive orders more often? Like, will this be a norm moving forward?
So I think that what you just talked about with the ideological asymmetry, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. You sort of set up an expectation of executive orders, and then if you have a lot of that asymmetry, I think executive orders are more likely to happen, right? Versus giving that local autonomy a little bit more weight. I mean, if when you look at the number of executive orders done on a presidential level, that happens a lot more when you have asymmetry between Congress and the president.
Yeah.
The Obama administration is a good example.
Yeah.
This Teresa, totally agree with Kathy, because part of in one of the articles that well, the one that I presented, that was kind of one of the author's main point as well, in regards to federal waivers, was that increased polarization, right, of Congress essentially, makes it to where the presidents have to use their executive power through executive order to get things flowing through and get things done. And I think that's the same thing in this COVID article, right? And I mean, I think it's situational as well, because emergency wise, the governors are essentially tasked as the CEO, right, of the state or executive power to make sure, to make things happen for the safety of the state residents. So I think though, hopefully there will be a balance later on, but the fact that with a pandemic setting the stage of more executive orders, yeah, it might continue on. That's my thought. Over.
Yeah, no, I agree. And with that, is there anything localities can do to reduce the preemptions that were set in place from the executive orders issued? Or like, do you even think it's necessary to reduce or eliminate any preemptions?
I think we're sort of seeing that all over, but like California, for example, a lot of the elected officials are just not enacting mandates or respecting preemptions.
Mhm.
And so take like, what was it, the sheriff of Riverside, and I don't know how many other sheriffs and fire chiefs. Well, the sheriffs are elected, and so there's really nothing that the federal government can do, and there's nothing the state government can do to sanction really them.
Mhm.
So they get to make their own executive orders, right? And that's sort of the messiness of federalism.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, so we've also seen localities just, like Paul said, just not adhere to mandates. In Texas, the governor signed an executive order mandating that there would be no mask mandates. So it's sort of a mandate squared or something. So schools were not allowed to mandate masks in school systems, public schools. And the biggest county, I mean, lots of counties and ISDs in the state still enacted them in defiance of the governor's order.
Yeah.
So there just might be, that just blatant disregard or acting contrary to what that is.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. And did anyone else have anything to add or any other comments? No, okay, well, thank you for sharing. And I believe that's the end. Oh yeah. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Good job, Delilah.
Great job, Delilah.
Very well done. This article really gets us thinking about, is this going to be, are we at the beginning of a new wave of executive orders from governors? I think you did a really nice job, and some of the things that really jumped out at me that you did, I like that visual about the number of executive orders from the Newsom administration as compared to previous governors. I think that really places it in a context very, very nicely for us, just to understand the sheer volume and amount of executive orders coming out of the governor's office during the pandemic. So I thought that was excellent. Also, it's point. I like the typology that you walked us through with the preemptions, obviously. And it's important to note that they're not mutually exclusive. You look at Florida. The Florida governor is using both a vacuum as well as punitive type of preemption, where he's saying, you cannot have any mask mandates in local school districts, and if you do try and have mask mandates, well, then we're going to fine you, and that's going to be the punitive measure. And so it's important that you can cross over and have hybrid approaches with these types of preemptions. The other point that I think is really important for us to help us look into the crystal ball in the future to see if we think we're going to see more and more of these executive orders was the discussion of the, I guess we'll call it, severity of the executive orders, how preemptive they are versus how enabling they are. And I think a really important point that you pointed out for us is that early on in phase one, the executive orders tended to be much more preemptive. But as we move into phase three of the pandemic, they start to look more enabling. And so I think that there is this direct correlation between the perceived severity of the crisis that you are addressing and the preemptive versus enabling approach that you're taking in addressing that type of crisis. So that may argue to us that perhaps these executive orders, we may not see them as frequently if we do get into a post-pandemic world as we're seeing them now. But it is kind of a path of least resistance for a lot of chief executives where they don't have to worry about going through the legislature. You know, at the federal level, we saw President Obama use a lot of these executive orders because he had a Republican Congress that wouldn't play ball whatsoever. And so he couldn't get anything through Congress. So instead, he would use the executive orders, which, you know, on one level is understandable. On the other level, when you have a chief executive using these executive actions, and you see that administration after administration after administration, that eventually is going to shift the balance of power away from Congress and toward the president. And the same type of thing can happen, obviously, at the state level as well. So again, that big question that I think we're going to be talking about probably for the next 5 years is, will these executive actions continue with other issues, even in a post-pandemic world? And so I think that what federalism scholars have is they certainly have themselves a nice research agenda on that topic over the next several years. So again, excellent job, great article, and I think you got all the important points out of the article for us. So very well done. Thank you. And we'll go to our final article in the class, which is the Fiscal Federalism and Economic Crises article. And that one then belongs to Jeremy. So Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I think I did this last time. I'm having an issue with Anyone give me some assistance on the sharing? Sorry about that. There it is. I got it. Sorry. All right. As Dr. Powell said, this is fiscal federalism, and specifically with the economic crises that we've experienced with COVID and the Great Recession. And so there's going to start off with a quick overview, introduction of the article. And before I begin, if I seem there's some really good stuff, and really I want to say I was kind of critical. Maybe I don't mean to be too critical of the article. And just for the defense of the author, this was written in June 2020. So it was, you know, there's so much going on with the pandemic, and things were changing so rapidly. So it's easy for me to sit back with the benefit of hindsight. So don't mean to be too critical, but I do get critical at some point. So after that, I'm going to get into the importance of the Fed's intervening during a crisis when it comes to fiscal policy and financial aid, and then talk about some of the impacts to the subnational governments during both of the crises, and then get into some of their fiscal responses, policy responses. All right, so the article begins off with a really pessimistic tone of fiscal federalism in the U.S. And I think we all agree that there's, you know, the bipartisanship, there's just a lot of issues with getting legislation passed. And so they focus really on the obstacles that we face for comprehensive policies during crises. And so the Trump administration is criticized for really the CARES package and all the aid packages having too many conditions or rules on spending, and also not extending it through the entire 2020. And then really we really saw this with the health mandates, just the fend for yourself, how they made the subnational governments really make their own decisions. So a lot of controversy with that, and it's still going on today. So I'm going to start off too with why should the feds intervene? And I've always been kind of partial to them, the federal government intervening, but this article really helped me better understand why it is so important. And the federal government, they have such extensive counter cyclical capacities when it comes to what they can do with printing money and increasing deficits. Angela was touching on that earlier with our budget deficit. And so on the other hand, states, local governments, they're naturally set up to have difficulties, whether it's balancing the budget. States can't default like local governments. There's restrictions on issuing debt. And then the revenue generation varies widely. Also, we're going to really touch on the services that local governments are required to provide in and out of a crisis. So that presents more challenges as well. So with that, with the dip in revenue and increase in services, it just makes it really difficult. And so the COVID-19 just had a really immediate impact, as we saw, the stay-at-home mandates and everything just sort of fell off a cliff, as we saw with the stock market, and our economy is just so dependent on services and hospitality, especially when it comes to employment. I have a number later. I want to say it's 2/3 or 3/4 of the employment numbers are from services. And so really the federal government, intervening from a fiscal standpoint, it's axiomatic that they need to intervene. And as I mentioned, that the subnational governments were responsible for service delivery. And this isn't a comprehensive list. I was just kind of throwing out some ideas for everyone to think about, from law enforcement to environmental to health programs. There's just so much that the public relies on from a local and state standpoint. And so, these local and state governments were really dependent on pro-cyclical revenue. So in strong economies, we're doing really well, especially, the states focus in tourism and hospitality. So some of the impacts that we felt, the cities that really thrived, that had lower unemployment, we saw that they had a lot higher revenue earners, that they could go work from home. We saw a lot of white collar jobs, big tech, office jobs, suburban development. We saw that push from moving from the city to the suburbs. And so that's still really driving housing prices, rental properties. So the places that are more metropolitan, probably they felt more of the pain during COVID than some of these other more suburban neighborhoods, and especially the areas that weren't focused in tourism and hospitality. And then really, if the state was focused on oil, I'm sure Kathy, you can speak to this with Texas. Anything dependent on oil and hospitality service, they were hit the hardest. The Great Recession and the COVID, the responses when comparing the two, the authors discuss there's three major points to it, and the first one is speed. And the authors show that it took almost 2 years for a major federal aid program to be introduced during the Great Recession, rather versus weeks in the pandemic. And so it's kind of funny. The author's leaning on, it was an election year and that's why it happened. But I'm kind of calling BS, because Trump was always known to pump up the economy whenever he could. He gauged his success on the stock market, which was kind of ridiculous. And he constantly harassed the Federal Reserve to keep rates low, which Federal Reserve is supposed to, be this independent body to control interest rates based on economic activity. And he was constantly trying to intervene. So I really don't think it was an election year. I think it was just, it was an unprecedented event, and we didn't really know how dangerous it could have been. So a lot of money was needed really quick, as well as just Trump, wanting to pass legislation to dump as much money on it to save the economy, because he gauged his success off that throughout his term. And so here's a cool graph. I really like graphs showing a comparison to to the COVID aid during the crisis. And so you see this big spike that the federal government provided, and that alone in 2020 equaled 5 years of aid during the compared to the Great Recession. So you could see just how much more was put into that fiscal response. And here's a quick overview. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry, I was not really mentioning. So the first was the speed. The second was quantity, which I just kind of touched on, and we saw that 5 times as much, or sorry, it was equal to 5 years of the Great Recession. The third is the quality of the aid and the fiscal response policy. And so I'm not going to get into each of these, but I wanted to just provide an overview of the different acts. And total CARES Act at 2.7 trillion at the time this was written. And the author just seems to really find this unacceptable just because there were too many conditions, and notes that the only unconditional support never made it past the Senate, and that was the HEROES Act. Here's another act. It was the Municipal Liquidity Facility. I really didn't know too much about this, but basically it excluded 97% of eligible governments because of the pricing was too high. So it wasn't even really helpful. But I kind of look at all this is this really a Trump issue? Is this just more of a Republican fiscal conservatism? And the authors note that, this has been happening for decades. So getting more into the quality of the fiscal aid. And so the authors do say, the CARES Act was much larger and swifter than its counterpart during the Great Recession. And it was much more rapidly introduced because it was an election year. And although it was much more expansive, because it wasn't unrestricted, it was sort of, not good enough or counterproductive. And so, I did some additional research on this to try and dive more. The article doesn't really get into the CARES Act and, why it wasn't as helpful as maybe the authors thought it should be. And there was a really important aspect of it, and that was there wasn't really a lot of conditions on the aid that was provided to big business in terms of they got all this funding that was supposed to help save jobs, but there weren't specific conditions in the aid package that required them to have oversight and actually use it to save employment. And so really it kind of went to their, straight into their balance sheets, which really only helped executives and, shareholders and, big corporations. And so that was really good. I wish the authors would have touched a little bit on that. And so here's my first question is, should we as policymakers provide unrestricted funding, blank checks to local governments to patch holes in their budgets?
Nope. I think there needs to be, there needs to be accountability, right? Because as a phrase, it keeps them honest. So I think, yes, provide funding and help, but whoever's receiving the funding, there need to be some kind of caveat that they need to be able to at least prove that the funding is being used for the intent, and not to just back to like this businesses to where just again putting it in their pocket and not for the intended use to help overall people.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Yeah, I was going to say that there's probably only one right answer, and that's it depends. So, I think that I think this had to be rolled out so fast that there wasn't really thoughtful care or thoughtful conditions put into it. With that said, there were certain pots of money within the CARES Act that were designated specifically. So whether or not they did a good enough job, it's arguable, but it seems to have at least made it through helped us make it through this thus far. All right. So the health of states during the crisis. So the authors really made a big argument that the healthy states, their fiscal or their balance sheets were healthy, and it was only limited to federal aid, or these three main topics. And so I really, as we learned in our finance class, it seemed that we were, our local governments were, the balance sheets were more healthy because it was really dependent on where the revenue came from. And so the article really fails to mention this. And really the internet sales were huge. I know in my city, city of San Juan, we did really well. I know that they were conservative, but we're seeing significant increases year over year. And it's mainly because of this internet sales, housing and development, car sales, things like that. So I was kind of surprised they didn't really touch on that. Although those are helpful, the three items that they mentioned, but it shouldn't really be limited to that. And so they later admit that the negative effects were not as widespread as they anticipated in 2020, and that 22, I want to say only 22 of the 50 states, but that's only almost 50%. So really the word only shouldn't be added in there. It's still a significant amount of the states had to cut their budgets. So then the authors, they start to get more into the fiscal policy responses that the government, subnational governments took. And so this first one, increasing revenues, this is more prevalent during the Great Recession, not so much during COVID, as it was seen as political taboo. And then also accessing reserves for rainy day funds. I think a lot of municipalities, even though my city did really well, we actually did that. We dipped into it, I think 20 or 25%. I think we learned that, a lot of municipalities did that. But during the beginning times of COVID, only 15 states used this method. So that was kind of surprising. And so from a state standpoint, the states, they rely heavily on spending cuts, which accounted for almost 50% of the states during the Great Recession. And I always kind of ask why and the how. And so it's a lot easier and quicker than raising taxes, that's for sure. And then I listed some of the things that were done, from a more of a, as you'll see in a later slide, more in a subnational government level in terms of like the layoffs and the furloughs. We actually saw increases in employment numbers at the federal level. But there's this big reduction in, a variety of different measures that they took. And so this is a graph that just shows that not all states actually took austerity measures and when it came to jobs. So the majority did have cuts, but there are actually a lot of states that had increases. And some more on the state's response and the uniqueness of the pandemic. And I ask a couple questions, what measures should be taken to curb the spread? And I list a couple of these here. And so this is kind of where it came to fend for yourself federalism, because there wasn't a clear-cut guidance from the Trump administration. And, a lot of the states abandoned the mandatory stay-at-home orders by mid-May 2020. And then we saw what happened right after that. The virus continued to surge and economic activity rebounded sharply, at the peril of just the virus surging and, the health, the pandemic spreading more. But we saw a surge in state revenue between the second and third quarters as well. This next slide really is a reminder of how our policies, when I say our, I keep referring to city, but really city and county local governments are shaped by state regulations, and it forces creativity for the local governments to enact a combination of measures, to do whatever works really for their jurisdiction. And so next question is, what did your government do? I kind of threw off some of the low hanging fruit, but I was curious if anyone saw any other measures that were taken by even your agency, your local government, what they did. Even if you want to expand on any of these is fine too.
The entity that I was working for, they limited class sizes. First, there were no classes, and then they also cut down class sizes. So that was part of the response. Ultimately, though, because of pressure from one of the locals, they increased class sizes at the school during the pandemic, and basically had us sign paperwork that said that the classes weren't that big.
Interesting. So, yeah, they're actually manipulating the numbers or just false documents.
Full blown.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So this last bullet point I kind of threw on there is I thought it was pretty interesting. I know that I heard a few things. I actually witnessed one myself. There was, I couldn't remember the name. What are those little, you had to like go to a secret spot, have a code name during Prohibition.
Speakeasy.
Speakeasy. Yeah, thank you. So there was, I went to a restaurant and I saw this little back room, and you know, one of the waiters saw me looking, and they like took me, hey, you want to check this out? And went back there, and it was like this cigar room where it was just like a secret room where everyone's back there, you know, just partying up. It was pretty interesting. And this was like right during the middle of the pandemic. I was pretty shocked. Smoking cigars, you know, drinking whiskey and just enjoying themselves, not really giving a care. Sure, that was happening in a lot of places, but it was interesting to see it. So one of the bullet points, I'll get into a little more detail on the deferred CIPs. Sorry, CIPs. I should have defined this. This is sorry, why am I drawing a blank? Capital improvement projects. So these are like publicly funded projects that governments do that are typically public property or right of way and or operated and maintained by the public. And so here's some of the reductions that you saw on those to try and help, you know, shore up their balance sheets during COVID. And so there were pretty significant cuts or delays, I should say. And then we also saw some cuts. So really in the parks and recreation area, and then also in the roads and sidewalks. And then also just taking on new debt. We talked about that a little while ago. A 22% increase on a 5-year adjusted basis. So that was pretty significant. Next, I'll get into another fun chart to show how employment was affected during COVID versus a Great Recession. And so the COVID you could see is that the C19 in parentheses in the Great Recession is in GR. And so you could see really at the onset of the Great Recession, you know, no significant moves were made. If anything, there were slight increases. And then it took a couple, like the author said, it took a couple years to see state and local start to decline. But, you know, during COVID-19, we saw drastic declines almost immediately. Oh, here was that number so the service sector makes up 75% of the US workforce, really significant. So you could see why, especially the private sector, took a big hit, and you know, while those unemployment benefits were really necessary to help out the public. All right, so here are some of the survey results from the immediate impacts. And so it showed 70% of the cities surveyed felt a negative impact, and 90% of those had 20% revenue losses on average. So it's highly likely for local governments to immediately cut staff that were dependent on the sales tax. So, you know, as we learned, I think there was an article in our finance class where the city of Santa Monica, they're heavily dependent on tourism, hospitality. So we saw big cuts there. But this next question is a little bit of conspiracy theory on my part. And I saw this with my local government. I kind of felt like they used it as a don't let a good crisis go to waste. They took cuts. The cuts were like very precise. They did it to older demographics that were either double dipping or just getting ready for retirement. And also they kind of picked on some of the people that didn't have the best work ethics. And so they used COVID-19 as an excuse to make these cuts. And in my opinion, we have finance directors. These people are, highly educated. They see all the numbers, they know what's going on, and they're seeing sharp rebounds. We didn't really start making cuts, until June, July, well into after the rebound, economic rebound already started. So I had a little conspiracy theory on, they knew that we were healthy all along, but used COVID-19 as an excuse. I'm sure that's not, didn't happen everywhere, but I think that some governments probably use it to their advantage.
Isn't the saying never let a good crisis go to waste?
Yeah, it's an old saying. I don't remember who's.
I'm not sure either. I'll look it up. Keep talking.
I want to say it was like was an army general or military general.
That absolutely happened at my work. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, I think what I see in government, or at least my government, there's all these protections for employees, and so you can't just get cut for no reason. So I think, the city manager and was sitting on this for a while, like, how do we make some cuts and reduce full-time expenditure, employee costs? And so I really do think that this was used as their benefit, and they continue to make fiscal policy moves that seem a little once you start looking under the hood, you just start to raise eyebrows, I should say. And the health of our cities is great now, and so and now they're spending doubling, tripling the budgets of these capital improvement projects, and we're doing all these fancy projects and fun projects like skate parks and things, and and they're taking sort of a victory lap with the city council. And it's kind of funny because just a few months ago they were saying, oh, we can't even afford to have staff and provide resources for for the public. So here's the outlook moving forward. And they actually, I think these numbers are pretty good, even though the article was written, in the summer of 2020. But so they expected 5.5% to 9% revenue shortfalls, and the actual levels were more optimistic. And so I was kind of curious. This next question is, is anyone still seeing their agency struggle, due to the COVID pandemic?
So what I'm seeing in my industry is right now we're at a lull in work. And I think what the lull in work has reflected was what you talked about earlier, where they pushed back capital improvement projects and things went back to being rebid. And even though the work is there and many of the contractors either rebid it or it just went to other contractors, the planning process, totally went to hell. And now we're seeing a lot of guys at the union hall, which means, they're unemployed, waiting for the big capital improvement projects to start. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, these things aren't going to start or everything went to hell in a handbasket. It just means, well, we're going to have to wait. And that's all happening after the first of the year. So that's kind of where we're at because of this.
Yeah, that's a good one, Paul. Thanks.
Can you take your class open?
For us, what we're seeing is a huge shortage in like substitutes, particularly. We're having a hard time filling a lot of positions in education, especially the classified positions. So things like bus drivers or food services. So they're actually across the state, they're asking like county Department of Ed people that are certificated to come into the classroom and start subbing.
Thanks. Yeah, it's another good example. I think, yeah, we hear a lot about that just in the private sector too, in the service industry, and in terms of difficulty in finding staff.
For my agency, we actually have a lot of people who've left, either due to the vaccine mandate or just we have a lot of mandates due to COVID, the things that we need to do now paperwork wise. So workloads have increased doubly. So we, rather than, we just can't retain people. Everyone wants to go.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. That's interesting. I have a very one side of my family is pretty conservative, and that side of the family, there's a couple people in the health industry, and there's a few of them talking, or actually they're already looking and made offers to just move out of the state, because of some of the mandates, which is kind of shocking. They just uproot. I think there's more to it. They're just sort of using this as like, all right, this is the last straw.
So Jeremy, on the flip side of that, it's happening in Texas for the opposite reason. People I never dreamed would leave Austin, the bluest dot in Texas, are looking for other places to live because of the crazy legislation that's been passed recently. So it's, and only people with some level of resources have the option of doing that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know Austin is going through a big development phase right now. I went out there for the first time recently, and yeah, saw all kinds of buildings and new developments going on.
It's been that way the whole 20 years I've lived here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the biggest thing about the skyline in Austin is cranes.
Oh,
Been that way for a long time.
Yeah, it's great city though. All right, thanks everyone. Last slide are just some of the conclusions. So this is sort of the author's sort of last point on their fiscal policies causing significant weight. But even in extreme partisan polarization and with the comprehensive federal aid package was launched, it seems kind of strange. He is, the argument of transactional and punitive, but everything worked out, okay or well enough, I guess, depending on where you stand and how you're really impacted. I know not everyone's okay, still a lot of people struggling. So, I guess it wasn't comprehensive enough. Definitely saw a lot of the fend for yourself federalism here, especially when it came to the health mandates. And then a couple other big lessons learned were how pro-cyclical state and local governments are on their revenue sources, and the services that they're required to provide. And so Fed intervention is absolutely necessary, was my conclusion. So that was a really good takeaway from the article I had. And then, the fragmentation of the US federalism just, still exists, with the political polarization, and, it's been going on for decades. And another thing that, I haven't really touched on yet, but it really shined a light on the structural weaknesses of the public health welfare systems during a crisis. And we saw all the hospitals get overpopulated, which, then that really causes a lot of panic. And so I think that was another big highlight that we saw. And that's it. Any questions?
I do have a comment that you, like the graphs that you have that sort of compare the activity and trend lines from 2008 to, I dare say that maybe Congress and the federal government learned something from from the response, right? Which is nice. Like our government, our representatives might be learning something, because it was always a complaint that it took so long for the economy to come back, right? And so, the question of whether you should sort of grant that money, no strings attached. I don't know. I think there's an argument for saying that maybe it's okay because, and they care about the stock market, which is at an all-time high.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to, I forgot to touch on was the Great Recession, it was, although the pandemic was unknown too, but it was more focused on health. So we didn't really know how dangerous it was going to be. The Great Recession, we didn't really know how systemic it was going to be. It was hitting governments worldwide, and it was so intricate, and really even the financial professionals didn't know, how systemic or how widespread it could be because of these, this package loan program they were doing, collateralized debt. And, so the experts didn't even really know. So it was, I think that, yeah, probably part of the delay as well is like, hey, we need to figure out what implications this could have. So I think that was probably another contribution to why there was that delay.
Mhm.
All right. Very well done. Thank you, Jeremy. I agree with your last. I agree with everything on your discussion. But the last point on your slide, I think, it really is what was my primary takeaway from the article, is that we know in our system of American federalism, it's going to give us variation. But when we have a crisis, especially an unprecedented crisis like the pandemic, it really does shine a light on that variation and what that variation really means for our everyday lives. And so, the variation we saw comparing California to Florida in terms of their responses is just a profound variation. I also like the discussion about, crisis as an opportunity. I think that is a very appropriate observation. And we have seen that. And we have seen some organizations that have downsized and found this as an opportunity to reduce their FTE. We've also seen some folks who are close to retirement just pulling the plug and saying, "That's it, I'm done. I may be 2 years away, but I can't do this anymore." And the point about education is also a very good one. And I know a lot of districts, they cannot hire subs, and they also can hire full-time teachers. And so it's next to impossible to fill those positions. I also think that, again, there are lessons to be learned whenever you have a crisis, certainly of this magnitude. And I think one of the lessons that states are going to learn is in terms of their revenue portfolios, because as you and the authors appropriately point out, some states fared very well, or at least fared somewhat well through the crisis, and some were somewhat decimated, depending upon their revenue diversity in the revenue portfolio. Those states that were highly that depended upon the food services and hospitality, those are the ones who were hit much harder by the pandemic than those who generate a lot of money from e-commerce. And so again, that variation really has a big impact upon how much these states feel a pandemic such as this. So again, we have to be careful because this pandemic is somewhat unprecedented. And so to try and extrapolate a lot of these practices that we've seen during the pandemic to future potential crises, we've got to be very careful there, because every crisis is different, and this one certainly was very unique in terms of its swiftness in which it came on, as well as unique in terms of the lack of information and the lack of definite knowing how to respond to it. We've had experience with economic downturns before. So sometimes we handle them well, sometimes not so well, but at least we have a track record in dealing with those. A pandemic that was as swift and profound as this one, we didn't really have much of a track record. And so I think that's why we saw a lot of this experimentation and, some successes and some failures. So I do also appreciate the "it depends" observation, because me, and I love "it depends," and it really does depend upon the crisis itself. But any crisis is really going to shine a light on the fragmentation and variability we get from our system of American federalism. So excellent. Very well done. Now that we've done all of our readings, and I think we've had really good, robust discussions of all those readings, I do want to kind of do a summation to kind of wrap up where we are now at the end of the class. And for me, there are really three main takeaways that I want you to walk away from the class with. One major takeaway is that American federalism is kind of how we perceive it. So how you define federalism will affect the way in which you interact within a federal system. So each week of this course, we've looked at federalism from a different perspective. So the first 2 weeks we looked at from the constitutional perspective. When you're looking at federalism from a constitutional perspective, you're going to focus primarily on the relationship between the national and state government. When state governments want to redress their grievances from the national government, if you're viewing federalism as a constitutional type of term, you're going to look to the Constitution for those protections. You're going to go to the federal judiciary to try and get a redress of your grievances. Then in the third week, we looked at the political aspects of federalism. When you view federalism politically, obviously it takes it out of the courts and it places it into the political environment. And it means your redress of grievances will come from lobbying as opposed to taking a case to the courts. In week 4, we looked at federalism from the fiscal perspective. And we talked about the use of grants as tools for getting the acquiescence of state and local governments. And so much of our federalism today and the relationship between our different levels of government really is very much predicated upon the use of money. Then the following week, we talked about the administrative aspects. And instead of talking about grants, we talked about mandates. Instead of the carrot approach, we talked about the stick approach. And when you view federalism from more of that administrative type of perspective, you're really going to start getting into the nuts and bolts of the day-to-day implementation of these policies and these programs and the true roles through indirect or direct administration that national, state, and local governments will play in the actual implementation of the policies and the programs. And then obviously for this week, we looked at some current and future challenges for federalism and intergovernmental relations. A lot of our emphasis today obviously was on the pandemic. And again, I think this focus on the pandemic is something that you're going to see in the federalism literature, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. So how we operate in a federal system depends upon how we view federalism. Is it a fiscal approach? Is it a political approach? Is it a constitutional approach? The second theme I'd like for you to take away from the class is the dynamic nature of federalism. Federalism is dynamic. It changes depending upon who is involved and what point in time they're dealing with federalism. So the way in which we viewed federalism before the Civil War is a lot different than the way in which we viewed it after the Civil War. The way in which we viewed it in the New Deal is a lot different than the way in which we viewed it in the Reagan administration. And so I think it's important that we realize that federalism is really, our interpretation of federalism will depend upon what period of time we are dealing with, because it is such a dynamic concept. And it's a dynamic concept, obviously, because of the way in which it was embodied in the Constitution. And then the third and probably most important theme I'd like for you to take away from the class is the idea that when you look at policies in the future, hopefully you'll also look at the intergovernmental components of those policies. It's what Sprague again referred to as the bloodless world of intergovernmental relations and politics. I want you to pay attention to that bloodless world, because oftentimes when we talk about policy, we talk about the issue itself. We don't think a lot about the intergovernmental aspects. And so hopefully the past 6 weeks in this class will kind of tune you into some of those intergovernmental politics and make you think next time you deal with a policy issue about what it means for the different levels of government. So that kind of is my cherry on top of the course. And so I hope you've enjoyed the course. I hope you found the course useful and that at least some of the readings were applicable to what you do. Now that we wrap up this course, obviously you've got a really quick turnaround. I apologize for that, but you're going to have a real quick turnaround, I believe, into 570, I think is the next class that you'll be going into. That's a class with Professor Gonchak. He is a adjunct faculty member, teaches on campus as well as teaches in our distance learning program. I think you'll find he has a lot of good practical experience and really combines practical experience pretty well with the theories that you'll be talking about in your negotiations course. I believe that course starts next week. Hopefully you've already gotten an email. I think Jenny said that email has gone out. So you know how CPI works. It takes a while for them to get everyone registered in the course and to make the course available. So hopefully you've had that contact and you kind of know what you'll be starting with then next Saturday with the 570 course. So before I let you go today, I know we are past 11, so I'm going to let you go in a minute. But just a reminder on the 697 case studies. Again, if you haven't completed all those, please try and get those submitted as soon as possible. Once your 5 case studies are all submitted, you can then do your final skills self-assessment, put together your portfolio, and then submit your portfolio to me through the OneDrive type of an approach. Again, we've got the video set up for you if you want the step-by-step instructions for how you submit through OneDrive. If you run any problems submitting through OneDrive, as always, shoot me an email, and I'm more than happy to help you out with that. But for the most part, I think it's a pretty easy, pretty intuitive type of process. So your portfolio can be turned in as soon as your 5 case studies are graded and your final skills self-assessment is complete. Anything else? Are there any questions or anything at all while you got me here on Saturday morning? As you are quickly progressing through the program, I'm sure as you've all noticed, and so we're coming up on that graduation relatively quickly.
Okay, I have a question. What else is new? Are there any plans for us to be in person at any point besides graduation?
Right now, graduation hopefully will be the in-person. I haven't heard anything about graduation yet. You know, last year the way they did it as Angel Stadium. It actually was really, really cool the way they did it last year. I had my doubts when I heard it first, their plans. I really loved it. I thought it went really well. So I'm 99.9% sure if nothing changes, it'll all be in person. We're not really planning on bringing the Saturday sessions back on campus just because of the limitations that we have placed upon us by the university. So we can only really have about 30% of our overall classes on campus. And so we've got some courses that have to be on campus. You know, those stats courses and those that require computer labs, you know, those have all been brought back on campus. So I'm thinking we're probably going to remain on Zoom until the end of the program. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, as always, working with you. Hope you've enjoyed the course, and good luck in 570. And any questions at all, as always, feel free to send me an email. All right, take care, everyone.
Oh, great.
Great, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Powell.
See you
Have a
guys.
great weekend.
Bye, guys.
Bye.